Hello, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt probably very interesting conversations until after we've had an opportunity to hear from our Chief Science Advisor. My name is Renata Osika. I wanted to welcome you to our afternoon sessions. I'm a volunteer with the conference. This panel has been organized and hosted by the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences. It is a national organization representing over 90,000 scholars and students. The panel will be moderated by the Federator's Executive Director, Gabriel Miller, right here. His current position at the Federation brings experience, leadership experience from Canadian Cancer Society and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Please join me in welcoming this panel, and Gabriel, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Renata. You can hear me? Good, okay. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and giving thanks for being on unceded Algonquin territory today. C'est un honneur d'être ici pour aider à animer une conversation à propos d'un sujet absolument vital. Looking around, we can see worrying trends in our civic life. Reason is on the run, and facts are losing their mojo. Sometimes outright lies are winning. Other times, the very concept of truth seems to be off the playing field and banished to the locker room. Before I ask our guests to share their insights, allow me to put one obvious question on the table. Can we just blame all of this on Donald Trump? According to the New York Times, there is simply no precedent for an American president to spend so much time telling untruths. The Times goes on to report that the president told public falsehoods on every day of his first 40 days in office, and many, many more since then. But we can't pin all the problems of our post-truth era on the back of Mr. Trump's golf cart. The spin that surrounds our politics here in Canada and around the world goes much further back than that. And the dishonesty we've witnessed recently in the Brexit campaign, from climate change deniers, from anti-vaxxers, and in rising nationalist movements, it has roots that go much deeper and much further than the former reality television star currently sleeping in the White House. En tant que directeur exécutif de la Fédération des sciences humaines, je travaille à représenter une communauté de plus de 90 000 chercheurs dans les domaines des sciences sociales et humaines. We need a range of perspectives, including the insights of scholars from the humanities and social sciences, to help us understand and address this problem. That's why I'm thrilled to have these people with us today. Rima Wilkes is a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia and a leading expert on public trust. She also serves as the president of the Canadian Sociological Association, which represents roughly 1,000 sociologists across the country. Lisa Kimmel is president and CEO of Edelman Canada. Edelman is the global communications and marketing firm that produces the annual Edelman Trust Barometer, one of the world's leading sources of data on global public trust levels across sectors. And finally, Mark Kingwell is a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto with expertise in social and political philosophy. Mark's columns feature regularly in the Globe and Mail. He is the author of several best-selling books, and he serves as a contributing editor of Harper's Magazine in New York. We'll begin the panel with some individual presentations from our panelists, and then we will begin a moderated discussion followed by time for your questions. Rima, I'll invite you to please get us started.
The first thing I have to say is that it is an honor to be an invited speaker here at the Canadian Science Policy Conference. But I have a confession to make. I kind of invited myself. You see, a few months ago, I received an email from a Mr. Peter Severinson from the Canadian Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences. And that's him right there. Okay. Yep. Mr. Severinson was contacting me in my capacity as the president of the Canadian Sociological Association. He was looking for a sociologist who was an expert on trust to speak at the upcoming conference in Ottawa. He wanted that person to provide a scientific audience with some context about what trust is and why it matters. He asked whether I knew anyone. This put me in a bit of a conundrum. I have published several papers on trust. This includes papers on race and social trust, papers on political trust, and an invited chapter in the Handbook of Social and Political Trust. So I thought that I might be qualified to speak on trust. But then I thought, well, maybe Mr. Severinson wanted somebody who's a bigger name in the field. I kind of felt like that kid who knows the answer and has his hand up, but the teacher, in this case, Mr. Severinson, refuses to call on him. I also didn't want to abuse my position on the CSA executive. So in my reply, I mentioned to him that I had published a few papers on the topic, and I gave him links to the papers just to kind of prove the credentials. And then I said I could do it, but if it wasn't what he had in mind, then I would be happy to recommend some other people. So I hope this was fair. I guess Mr. Severinson bought it. And with that said, I will leave you to decide whether this information about how I came to be here today makes you more or less trusting of what I have to say. Certainly, most of us have a general notion that trust is important. On the other hand, saying that trust matters might seem like one of those common sense does that sociological research is sometimes accused of illuminating. My hope is that my presentation today will convince you that trust is the foundation of everything you do in your professional capacity, whether you are a scientist, a policymaker, or an industry professional. So what is trust anyway? Trust is a generalized expectancy that the word, promise, verbal or written statement of an individual or group can be relied on. There is an assumption that trust entails some judgment that a relationship is reciprocal, though it is not assumed that this is a de facto exchange relationship. In the social sciences, we study trust by analyzing the results from survey questions that ask people how much they trust. One of the most widely used is the simple statement, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? We also like to think about how much people trust institutions. This could include the justice system, the political system, or importantly for our purposes today, science. I will return to science in a minute. Why is trust so important? Trust matters because without it, we can't get anything done. In the social sciences, we are particularly interested in trust because you need to trust strangers and you need to trust institutions in order for society to work. If you think about tribal or small closed communities, everyone knows each other and knows that they can trust their own people and kin. But what happens when societies grow? If you only trust your own family and friends, you can't work with anyone else. You can't make business agreements, you can't have elections, In fact, you can't even cross the street. This is why social scientists think that trust and the relationships that it engenders is what makes democracy possible. Certainly, this was the observation that Alexis de Tocqueville made when he first visited the United States in the 1700s. In Democracy in America, he says that Americans use associations to give fetes, to found seminaries, to build inns, to raise churches, to distribute books. And in this manner, they create hospitals, prisons, and schools. This associational life creates trust, and this, in turn, facilitates democracy. And it was a concern over the decline in this kind of civic participation and a concomitant decline in social trust over the past several decades that motivated Robert Putnam to write his acclaimed book, Bowling Alone. The argument Putnam makes is that if we want healthy democracies, we shouldn't just worry about whether we have enough human capital, such as education, language, or occupational skills. We should also concern ourselves with social capital, the relationships and trust that facilitate all interactions we have with each other, and therefore allow us to get things done. Now, the issue is why you, an audience of scientists, policymakers, and industry professionals, should care about trust. How is trust relevant to you and the work you do? Well, one option is to focus on the public. We could definitely focus on the antitrust and anti-science messages that are coming from high-ranking political leaders and social media sites. This includes anti-environmental and anti-vaccination messages. But to me, this means that the problem is out there. The other option is to focus on ourselves and ask, how can we be more trustworthy? Let's instead consider something which I assume is close to your heart, which is research funding. How many people in this room, hands up, have ever held an NSERC grant? Okay, how many of you are policymakers that might be somehow tied to getting grants? And what are the rest of you? Are you industry, would we say industry professionals, or how would we categorize you? That's what I was told was going to be the audience. Have I totally misread the audience? Okay, let's assume that you're somewhat interested in research funding. Okay, if you have ever applied, if you know from NSERC, the science, in order to get one of these grants, you actually have to sign a statement just to submit your application that says, I understand that maintaining public trust in the integrity of researchers is fundamental to building a knowledge-based society. The statement then references breaches of trust, things like fabrication, falsification, destruction of research records, plagiarism, self-plagiarism, and conflict of interest. Why do these breaches matter so much that everyone who applies has to sign this statement on trust? The reason is that these breaches don't just destroy trust in your work, they destroy trust in everyone's work. Importantly for NSERC is that they destroy trust in NSERC itself. If the public doesn't think that NSERC can be trusted, then they won't support funding NSERC, which means they won't support funding science. But trust isn't just about faith in either NSERC or research scientists. When scientists can be trusted, this reduces the cost of doing science. And by reducing these transactional costs, this increases scientific productivity. Think about how micromanaged we would have to be as scientists without trust. So to that end, how can we build more trust? We can start by reminding ourselves that science isn't just a job, it is a calling. And we need to remind ourselves of who we do science for. This isn't always that clear. Are we accountable to our team members, or are we accountable to organizations, to funders, to the public, to science, or to ourselves. Clearly, it is all of these. Still, there are going to be times when, in order to be seen as trustworthy, we have to choose between these sources of accountability. And that is exactly what I believe two scientists who you may have heard of epitomize. Some of you may recall that in 2010, the Conservative government canceled the long-form census. In protest, the head of Statistics Canada, Munir Sheikh, resigned. He said that a voluntary survey cannot become a substitute for a mandatory census. After he resigned, I wondered about his successor, Wayne Smith. Was his willingness to take on this position in the face of such a troubling challenge to valid scientific data evidence that he was a careerist with no principles? But then, much to my surprise, in 2016, he too resigned. He took issue with claims by the government that Statistics Canada could stay independent while being part of the Shared Canada Services system, which I don't understand, but I think it's very important, or he says it's important. Now, I cannot know how the general public understands the decisions these two individuals made. But as someone in the know about data, I will say that in meddling in the affairs of StatsCan, the government has diminished my trust in government and politics. However, because of what these two leaders did, I also feel like the public service and that this particular scientific agency can be trusted, and that can only be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'll ask Lisa Kimmel from Edelman, Canada, to come up and speak.
Thank you, Gabriel. I'm also delighted to be here with you today. And as Gabriel mentioned in the introduction, can I just have a show of hands of people who are familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer? Okay, a handful of people. So I'm going to be presenting to you the findings from our 2017 Trust Barometer. And what I will tell you is that the results are quite disturbing, not only on a global level, but on a Canadian level. And it's not surprising once you see the results based on what we've seen in terms of the rise of populism in many Western democracies, the US, the UK, France. But what these results actually reveal is that we're not immune to populism in Canada either. So in terms of methodology, this is a survey that looks at trust across 4 key institutions: business, media, government, and NGOs. We have been doing it for the last 17 years across 28 countries, including Canada, and we look at 2 different segments of the population. The first is what we call the informed public, which are those people who have a higher level of income, education, and they're also higher consumers of media. And then the mass population, which is everyone excluding the informed public. The results that I'm going to share with you were in field at this time last year in Canada between October 17th and November 13th. And if you'll recall, that was at the time of the US election. And so there's no question that the results for Canada would certainly have been impacted by what was going on south of the border. But the results aren't good. We look at what we call the trust index, which is the average level of trust across the 4 key institutions that I mentioned: business, media, government, and NGOs. And this shows you the results over the last 3 years. And we look, based on the results, we look at those countries that are trusted, that are neutral, and are in the distruster category. And in 2017, for the first time in the 17-year history of the Edelman Trust Barometer, Canada has actually fallen into that distruster category. Now, we are slightly higher than the global average, which was 47. We're at 49, but that is certainly not good news for us in Canada. Now, if we break down the results further, though, what we start to see is a trend that you'll see in all of the subsequent slides that I present to you, and that is that when you break out the informed public and the mass population, we see in Canada that the informed public is actually trusting of institutions in Canada, whereas the mass population is not. And so what that suggests is that if you are an elite and you are part of that informed public, you think that things in this country are going quite well. However, if you're part of the masses, that's not necessarily the case. And so what we see over the 5 years, the past 5 years, is something that is disturbing in Canada, that there is a growing gap between the informed public and the mass population in terms of their level of trust across the 4 key institutions. That gap in 2017, 15 points, and when you look at the right-hand portion of the slide, the countries where we saw the largest gap between the informed public and the mass population, the US, the UK, and France, all countries where we have seen that rise of populism. And then in Canada, if we break down trust across each of the 4 institutions year over year, what you see is a decline in trust across each of them in Canada. Where we have seen the largest gaps, the largest decline rather, is in media and in government at 10 points each. So now I'm going to quickly go through each of the institutions and what we're seeing. So trust in government. Again, looking at the 5-year trend, what you see is that in 2017, we see a significant decline of 10 points year over year, as I mentioned, in trust in government, but also a widening gap between the level of trust of the informed public and the mass population in Canada. Now, I should point out that we anticipated that in 2017, there would be a decline in trust in government because when we did the survey the previous year, it was at the time of the federal election. Because we've been doing this survey for so long, what we consistently see is any time that there is a change in government in a country, the level of trust not only increases in government, but we see an increase across all of the institutions. So we knew that in Canada there would be a decline a year into the Liberals being in power, but we didn't anticipate that the decline would be as dramatic as it was. Now, to better understand the decline in trust in government, one of the questions that we asked respondents was, which institution do you believe is responsible for the country's problems? And not surprisingly, government came out on top for the majority of respondents. But then when we asked which institution is responsible for fixing those problems, same thing, government, most expected to fix the country's problems. One interesting stat that came out was the large percentage, 31% of respondents, who actually believe that the media is responsible for the problems in this country. And if the role of media is to hold both government and business accountable, this is a serious issue for media in this country. So now let's talk about trust in media. Again, similar trend, dramatic decline in trust in media year over year, and a widening gap between the level of trust in media for the informed public and the mass population. Now, when we look at the 5-year trend for media, and I don't have a slide that actually breaks this out, but in terms of all kinds of media, we're seeing a dramatic decline. The one where we're seeing the most significant one over the last 5 years is traditional media. Trust in traditional media has actually gone down 13 points over that time period. And it's not surprising, given the rise of fake news, the fact that media were relying on polling numbers that did not anticipate outcomes of elections, the Brexit vote in the US, et cetera. So there's a real credibility issue for media in this country. And so one of the things that we wanted to explore this year was the echo chamber phenomenon. The notion that people consume, receive, and share information that substantiates their own point of view. And we were really troubled by the results in this country. That of the respondents, more than 1 in 3 respondents agreed with the statement that they would support a politician if they were going to do good for themselves and their family, even if they exaggerated the truth. That 55% of respondents will not change or be open to listening to an opposing point of view on a particular topic. These are really troubling numbers for Canadians. And then again, going back to that lack of trust in media, the fact that 60% of respondents trust a search engine over a human editor, if I'm a member of the media, that is very, very disturbing. And then we also asked respondents about the kinds of sources that they actually trust. And these results, also troubling. People trust an individual at 70% versus an institution. They're also much more open to the messages of someone who is viewed as a reformer versus someone who wants to preserve the status quo. And then lastly, information that is leaked is almost 3 times more trusted than is information that is issued by a company or an organization. When we look at trust in business, this is actually the only institution where we saw an increase in trust amongst the informed public. But again, that gap is widening over the 5-year period of 15 points between the informed public and the mass population as it relates to trust in business. So what does all of this tell us? It suggests that when we look at all of the countries that we survey, when we ask respondents whether or not they believe that the system is working, in 14 of the 28 countries, the answer was no, the system is not working. And when you see where Canada lies on that continuum, highlighted, we're literally on the verge. We are at the tipping point of the general population in this country believing that the system is failing us. And then again, talking about immunity to the rise of populism, when we asked specifically about respondents' specific fears or concerns that they have around issues that are tied to populist movements, corruption, globalization, immigration, pace of innovation, what you see here is a comparison between the Canadian responses and the US responses. And in every case, there's only about a 7 or 8 point gap between the responses of those in Canada versus the US. So how is it that we can look to build trust? We have come up with 16 trust-building attributes, and essentially this slide is a playbook for how it is that an organization can look to build trust. The ones that are most important fall under the 2 top categories, integrity and engagement. And the 3 attributes that are most important to respondents in Canada are the following. Ensuring that you are conducting business in an ethical way, that you're treating employees well, and lastly, that you listen to customer needs and feedback. But the interesting thing that you see in this slide is the importance that people place on those attributes and how they think that organizations are actually performing against them. And those are the 3 attributes that are most important, also have the most significant gaps between importance and performance. We also look at the credibility of spokespeople to speak on a variety of different topics. And what you see here is quite disturbing. So I don't think it will be any surprise to any of you in the room that an academic or a technical expert is viewed as most credible. But you also see the decline year over year in trust in academic and technical experts. And a person like yourself is almost as trusted as is an academic or a technical expert. And then on the other end of the scale, you see boards of directors, government officials, and CEOs. So reality is that anything that I am telling you right now should not be trusted. And a person like yourself is trusted almost 2 times as much as is a CEO. Now, it's important to note for any leader that these results don't suggest that you should shirk your responsibilities in terms of communicating with your constituents, be it employees or the general public. But leaders need to be thinking about how it is that they can engage those people who are actually viewed as more trustworthy. And one that I think is significantly underleveraged for organizations is the use of employees. Because employees within an organizational context are viewed as most trusted. And they're most trusted to talk on a variety of different topics, from the treatment of employees, that's not surprising, but even things like financial earnings and operational performance. You would think that the CEO would be viewed as the most credible person to speak on that topic, and yet respondents say, no, it's employees that need to be talking about it. So what does this all say? In summary, what we're seeing is a fundamental shift. So the old model was such that you had at the top of a pyramid the informed public, the elites, who wielded both influence and authority. And there was a view amongst the mass population that A, if you worked hard enough, you would eventually become part of the elite. And secondly, that those in positions of power would be looking at looking out for the best interests of the mass population. Well, with the advent of social media and the democratization of information, that pyramid became inverted, with the masses holding both influence and authority. And now people who are part of that informed public and part of the elite are literally left with an empty bag trying to figure out how it is that they lost both influence and authority. And so what we're proposing is a new model that institutions need to be working with the people, with employees, with the public, in looking at how it is that we can tackle societal problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. In our last presentation, before we open it up for a little bit of discussion among the panel members and then questions, is Professor Mark Kingwell.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I thank Gabriel and Peter and the Federation for asking me to be part of this panel. I thought I would break my opening remarks into 3 fairly obvious parts, but maybe not in the obvious order. So what I'm going to talk about is the present, the past, and the future. To start with the present, I don't think I need to rehearse any of the things that were implied in Gabriel's opening message, although I'm going to expand on one important point, and that is the status of the current American president in respect of larger political developments, which I think have been overshadowed by what is in many ways a kind of freak show that has much deeper implications than the daily news cycle allows. But even before I get to that, like many of you perhaps, I open my day by looking at headlines from a variety of news sources. Speaking of trust, trying to triangulate or triple triangulate my sense of how the world is by consulting a variety of websites, traditional media, right, left, center, with no affiliation that can be discerned, et cetera, et cetera. Two things jumped out at me this morning, and they may have struck you as well if you saw them. Striking statistics that show massive rises in hate speech instances on social media, electronic media around the world, including in Canada. Rises sometimes on the order of 300 to 600% over previous recorded instances. In Canada, of course, we have hate speech legislation, but it has proven so far largely ineffective to control, let alone address, some of the new media forms of hate speech. This is a concern for everyone, and I think it is, in a way, a shadow that falls over our discussion today. The second thing was, and I only recently became interested in this subject because I was not aware of it, but as people in your line of work, you will know about this, the reproducibility crisis in scientific results. In a recent survey, almost half of practicing scientists said that they were unable to reproduce results from previous experiments. This strikes me as something that is both puzzling and deeply shocking, not least because for many of us outside the practicing scientific community, the reproducibility of results seems to be part of the gold standard, or had always seemed to be part of the gold standard of the scientific method. If a result is a one-off, how reliable could it possibly be? In fact, some of you may know that for many years, I don't think it exists anymore, there was a satirical academic journal called the Journal of Irreproducible Results, which only published articles by one author ever. So these are things drawn from today's headlines. The larger present picture, again, I don't have to dilate at any length, but here's one thing I want to say about the question of the status of the current president. There is a much larger and deeper political problem which goes beyond both the current White House and beyond the rhetoric, which I think is misleading, the dichotomous rhetoric of two sides, or the both sides, or the divide. And that is that there has been a fundamental shift in the nature of relationship between demos and government, or the state. And that is to say that I think since at least the first Bush administration in the US, certainly the second Bush administration, there has emerged in American politics and in European politics something that I think we should call postmodern right-wing realpolitik. What do I mean by that? Well, you may recall that the original ideas concerning postmodernism, or the postmodern condition associated with French philosophers like Jean-François Lyotard, came from the left. They were critiques of a reified social order and political elitism, a dismantling of edifices of authority and privilege in favor of claims concerning social construction, including social construction of science and of institutions. As Lyotard himself put it, incredulity towards meta-narratives, that we could no longer take seriously large stories of progressive advance and hereditary and hierarchical authority. That postmodern leftism had its effect and left its mark on generations of activists and intellectuals. It had, I think, revolutionary political effect in some places around the world. But at the center of the West, of the neoliberal West, there was a political inversion of those ideas, a kind of clever inversion, taking this notion that there is no final authority and making it into a sanction for the freedom to do as one wishes. The classic statement of this was contained at first anonymously in a New York Times article, New York Times Magazine article, excuse me, a famous quotation where a Bush administration, Bush II administration functionary who later was identified as Karl Rove said to the interviewer, "You belong to the reality-based community. We are different. We're an empire, and we're building our own reality as we like. And you guys in the reality-based community will go on studying us and trying to figure out what we're doing, and meanwhile, we'll be building the next thing that we want." That's postmodern right-wing realpolitik. This is an updating, if you like, without any deep metaphysical foundation that might makes right. That whatever a given state wants to do is the truth. We've seen versions of it before, of course, but perhaps not with such an obvious and cynical basis in nothing but itself. So that is the present that I think gives rise to the current president. Even though he does not conform consistently to this view, he is an expression, a kind of carbuncle, if you like, that emerges from these enabling conditions. Turning to the past. In the past, my image, this may recall Philosophy 101 if you ever took it, in Plato's Republic, the parable of the cave. In the parable of the cave, expertise and truth are the same thing. So the philosopher is the person who reveals the truth, and in so doing establishes his bona fides as the expert. There is no slippage between these. And the parable of the cave indicates what has to be true for this to be the case. I won't go through all the details. You probably recall some of them. The prisoners are trapped down at the bottom of the cave. All they can see are the shadows on the wall in front of them, and they take that to be reality. In fact, those shadows have been projected from behind them, and they need to free themselves and go past the people projecting the shadows, ideologues, demagogues, and liberate themselves up into the truth of the light that lies outside the cave. The philosopher is the person who does that and then leads the others out. Now, to have that notion of the truth and that notion of expertise relies upon having a kind of close relationship to capital T truth, or capital G good in Plato's view. The two are the same thing. It seems to me that we don't have to be postmodernists today to find such an account implausible. We live in at least a modern, if not postmodern era, in which this notion of a singular expert who is in sole possession of the truth strikes us as bizarre and untenable. The cost of our own liberation, though, has been the kind of crisis of legitimacy that we see now. So in the early modern period, this is lickety-split history of ideas, we freed ourselves from particular agreements about the nature of society, that each one of us might have our own view of what a good life looks like, and we could coexist, perhaps, within that. That's liberalism in the classical sense. But that too posed a challenge for the nature of truth and the nature of expertise. My time is up already. But here's the, okay, so can I say something about the future? I'm living in the future since my time is up, right? I mean, I'm in a post-temporal state now. What the future, I can say more about this in the discussion. What we need is not more return to the pre-modern, but what I'm going to call the post-postmodern. And I'll talk more about this in detail, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about forms of benign regulation like nudging from Thaler and Sunstein and scaffolding from social science. But since my time's up, I'll stop talking now.
Thank you very much. And Mark, we will definitely find an excuse to let you finish talking to us about the post-temporal future. Thank you very much. This has worked out better than I'd even hoped, because I really feel like we've gotten three distinct perspectives on this. One about sort of where we're at socially and how fundamental trust and truth is to just the basic functioning of our lives on a day-to-day basis. Some, a real glimpse statistically at where Canadians are at as a country, but also as compared to other parts of the world in terms of our feelings about our institutions and about the people that we turn to for answers. And then finally, Mark helping, I think, to help us understand some of the freak show we've seen recently in a broader context, and some of the intellectual ideas and forces that have been used and abused in creating the moment that we're living now. So we're going to spend a few minutes digging a little bit deeper with our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. you've all actually gone a little bit, some distance in answering the first question I was going to ask you. So I'm going to try and go a little bit further with it. It seems to me everyone agrees, what I heard, that whatever we're observing in the last couple of years and whatever we're seeing in the United States under Trump, we are also in the grips of forces and trends that go much further back than that. So what I'd like to know, though, is then what are your thoughts about what we're feeling and experiencing right now? Because it does seem like something has changed. It feels like a tipping point has been reached or a straw has snapped. And suddenly there's been a kind of jarring change in what's acceptable to say, what the rules are for governing our public discourse, what counts as a valid and defensible reason for believing something. So I guess what I'd just like to ask your thoughts on is, have we made some kind of new step into a post-truth era in the last 1, 2, 3 years? And how do you connect that moment to the trends that you've been seeing over the years previous to this? And maybe I'll start with you, Mark.
When post-truth was accepted by the OED as one of the new words in the established lexicon of English, they defined it as the replacement of empirical and argumentative discourse by emotion and anger or opinion, I guess, something like that. So that shift. But that, of course, is not new. And then what's new, it seems to me, is not the legitimation crisis, as I put it. We've seen legitimation crises before. What is new is how the focus on discourse has become so predominant. And that's partly because of the technology, our immersion in technology. That is new. So this is different from, say, 68. So 68 in France, 68 in Germany, the 60s in the US. That's absolutely a legitimation crisis on a scale even larger probably than what we're going through now. But you didn't have Twitter, and you didn't have Facebook, and you didn't have blogs. And there was still some substantial trust in traditional media, like newspapers. The Wall Street Journal and New York Times could be relied on. So that's the big shift in respect of that, our moment versus that moment. When you have a president whose main means of communication is 140 characters at a time, that's unprecedented. That's more unprecedented, it seems to me, or more importantly unprecedented than the fact that he lies all the time, that is the favored form of communication. So in terms of what it means for democratic politics, this is something that we have never really been able to solve. Our relationship to the state is always fraught. The model that has dominated for a long time, let's say in the post-war consensus, was the smooth transition or transaction of taxes for services. And you didn't actually need more than that to make government run, and quite big government. And that worked until people started saying, well, hey, wait a second, we want the government to reflect our desires and our beliefs more than just provide services. I think we still haven't solved the problems that were raised in the 60s with that post-war consensus. This is the long tail of the 60s in some ways.
Lisa?
So I completely agree with Mark that it's really technology and the advent of social media which has just added fuel to the fire. And now we live in a world where top-down communication does not exist. And as a result, people have influence and they have authority, and they can share and spread misinformation that is then shared within their own echo chambers. And that's really dangerous because people are only consuming information that substantiates their own point of view. Highly problematic. So one of the things that we talk about to our clients is the importance of if you manage a community and you have a Facebook page for your brand or your organization, or you have a handle on Twitter, you need to be following people who have a different point of view so that you understand what those are, because at the end of the day, regardless of what institution you are, if you aren't understanding your audiences, your constituents, your stakeholders, even if they do have a different point of view than yours, you're never going to be able to build trust with them.
Can I add just one quick thing to this? Because we all know about confirmation bias, I think. So we tend to, highly value the things that support the things we already believe and devalue the ones that don't. But psychologists are now finding results that indicate the problem is far worse, that we're far more irrational even than that. And so they've given a new label to what they call my side bias, which is beyond confirmation bias. It's that when I have a view and I'm shown evidence to the contrary, even if I accept the evidence as valid, I still hold to my original view. Like, yeah, you're absolutely right about climate change, but it's still a hoax. So, I mean, that's where the scaffolding and the nudging comes in, right? That's where Thaler comes in, starting from the basic irrationality, not basic, the frequent irrationality of human beings in respect of their own beliefs, that sometimes you have to actually, as policymakers, you have to push people to make better choices because they won't make them autonomously.
The next question I'm going to start with you, Rima, but did you want to add anything on this before we go on?
How about we see what the next
Okay.
question is, and I'll see which one I prefer.
Well, the next one is a little bit more of a personal question. And this is when we talked about when, as a group, we were preparing for today. Something I've thought a lot about, and I have to admit, for me, my preoccupations does seem to involve an awful lot of thinking about Donald Trump, and that's much to the detriment of my quality of life. But when I think about that, I'm also brought back to a moment several years before that when I remember feeling the sensation that something was changing in our politics that was unfamiliar and strange to me. And that was following the election of Rob Ford in Toronto. Because, not because of my particular political views on left or right, but because things that I thought were automatic disqualifiers for candidates for political office didn't seem to hold anymore. And the rules about who won a debate or who was going to pull ahead in an election just didn't seem to be operating the same way. So that was sort of like a personal light bulb moment for me. I wanted to ask you guys, and I was really thinking about you, Rima, because of the way you talked about how trust is at the foundation of everything we do professionally, and maybe personally too. From a personal point of view, is there a moment that stands out for you in your personal history when you have felt this change in trust, either as an educator, as a researcher, or as a citizen?
I guess for me, I had a transformative kind of moment. This may not come as a shock to some of you, but even though we are paid to teach, some of us don't necessarily love teaching the way we're supposed to. And, and I think it's the whole culture where you get these teaching buyouts and like, what's the message about teaching and about students? If it's something to get out of, there's no research buyout, right? But there's a teaching buyout. And you go on sabbatical. I'm on sabbatical right now. And what does that mean? I don't have to teach and I can just do research, right? And so there's this sort of constant underlying negative message about it. And for me, I'm not sure that I viewed my students in as positive a light as I could have. And about 10 years ago, I started volunteering at UBC has a storefront on the downtown east side of Vancouver. And And it's to make UBC accessible for people from that area. I don't know if everyone's familiar, but it's like a really high poverty area. And I was doing some seminars there, basically taking the material that I did in my regular teaching Canadian society and teaching it there, doing seminars. And I don't know why, but I saw people just getting off the bus to come to the class. And it hit me how much effort they were putting into coming. And that made me really feel much more accountable about my responsibility to like do the best job I could possibly do for every class, because somebody could be traveling 2 hours to hear what I have to say or to be part of that class. And I have to take it incredibly seriously. And then that got me thinking about the fact that my job is taxpayer funded, and that, you know, I'm accountable to taxpayers ultimately, not just myself and my own career. So for me, that was kind of a transformative moment, I guess.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think I'll go to Mark on this one next, and then we'll finish on this question with Lisa.
I probably could echo the Rob Ford comment and others. I still remember, this is a late moment, but last November during the debate right after the locker room comment, which I won't repeat, and I thought, well, that's it, it's over. I was watching with some friends in Philadelphia, and we were smoking cigars, and we were like, this, it's done. But going back for the much more positive notion of a light bulb, I guess, in respect of the notion of trust, I was having an argument with my late friend Russell Morrison, who worked in finance for many years. And I had written something about trust and transaction. And he said, you're barking up the wrong tree. Well, he used a saltier expression than that. I was full of something. And he said, when I go into the bank, there's no trust involved. I just go up to the teller and I perform the transaction. And I said, how can you say that as a financier? Markets are trust. They don't exist if there isn't trust. Currency is trust. You're walking around with pieces of paper or plastic in your pocket, and you think that represents your transactional ability. It does, but only if there is a network that supports it. Take away the network, and they're just plastic and paper. And this, for me, was a part of a larger argument about how irked I get when people talk about redistributive taxation schemes, because they're distributive, but they're not redistributive as if you had something and then the government takes it away from you. There's only something to have because there is a government that supports the system in which having is possible. I know I probably sound, very socialist, but that's it. Here I stand. But anyway, I think I convinced Russell in that moment about the question of trust, and that for me was a bit of it sharpened my sense of why that argument is so important.
Great. Lisa?
So I would say that notwithstanding President Trump, one of the things that I'm actually hopeful around is that, and I'm in the business of supporting and helping clients to build, maintain, restore trust and reputation, is that increasingly we're seeing in all facets of society people who are falling from their positions of authority based on their behavior, their violation of trust, when you think about a Harvey Weinstein or Mark Halpern, and then people in other areas of our lives as well, that the level of scrutiny that now exists is actually positive and moving us in the right direction, that people will not tolerate people who are in positions of authority, who are, obviously completely, not conducting themselves in ways that are acceptable.
I really want to follow up on that question, and I'm going to. I'm also going to suggest that if there are people in the audience who have questions that they'd like to ask, there are microphones here and here, and you feel free to start making your way over to them. I'm going to ask one more follow-up here, and then maybe we'll mix in some questions from the audience. I'm really interested in what you just said, Lisa, and I'd like thoughts from anyone on the panel, because I think It seems like there's a genuine dilemma here. And I think Weinstein and Cosby, the incident with Bill Cosby, help illustrate this. On one hand, your slide showed us, in the case of business, ethical business practices are one of the things that build public trust. And presumably rooting out these kind of problems, not just in business, but in any part of human life, is ultimately important to having trust. But I would bet that both of these incidents, for now, are going to have a depressing effect on trust, in that people see this awful thing and these terrible things that have been done over time and that have been, in many cases, brushed under the rug. Am I right about that? That there's a kind of paradox that reform ends up exposing things that actually make people trust less? And is there anything we can do to help people be comfortable with that cycle in a way and actually see the positive in these exposés and these revelations?
So I would actually argue that it should lead to an increase in trust. The fact that companies and organizations are no longer going to tolerate such behavior and are making changes and ousting leaders who are behaving inappropriately, that actually signals that there's an openness to change and that there's zero tolerance for that kind of behavior.
That's interesting. Is it either of the other two? Okay, we'll start with you, Una.
I might just add that maybe a qualifier to that is it might depend on how the breach of trust came to light. So was the disclosure voluntary or was it coming from outside? Because I think that changes how people see a particular individual or institution.
And the only thing I was going to add is I think it needs to cycle out before you're going to see the upswing in trust. That is, I actually agree with you. I think in the short term, you're going to see a depression because people are like, everybody's corrupt, all institutions are messed up, every news organ just has its own interest. I mean, all the kinds of things that you hear right now. We need to see then positive versions emerging that we can get behind. One thing I was going to say in the last part of my presentation is we don't need a capital T truth account to do this. Right? We can have radically decentralized and local language games of truth, if you like. Science is one. Science doesn't need a capital T metaphysical notion of truth. It has method. So we can do likewise with public discourses, plural. There isn't just one public discourse. So you can establish trust and civility and positive outcomes within a mini network within public discourse that then can have a positive network effect eventually by hooking up with other networks.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I would like to focus on solutions, so I'd like to thank Lisa in particular for outlining some things that we can actually do. And I totally agree with you that authorities and organizations need to work with the public, and I would like more ideas about how that can be done. I'm a social science researcher, and I work mainly with people living on low incomes. And one thing I notice about this science policy conference is the excitement about technology and the future, and I can tell you that it's the exact opposite from the people that I work with. They're afraid. They're afraid. They're losing their jobs. They feel very uncertain. Everything they believed in is gone. So I would like to hear how we can bridge that gap. How can we bridge that gap? In ways, how do we talk to people? Like the other thing that's very positive is we're now focusing on educating kids about science, and that's wonderful. But there's a bunch of adults out there who don't have basic science literacy, and they're the voters. So we also need to do outreach to adults with basic science literacy. So I'd like to hear your ideas.
Okay, so solutions in particular to the problems that we've been talking about today.
You're looking at me. Okay. Well, I once said that basic literacy is the software of democracy, and I think we could. And I mean literally, being able to read and write. You can't have a functional democracy without democratizing that basic skill. It's a necessary condition of people being able to educate themselves. I think we could easily include science literacy to that too, because in the world in which we live, science, and especially applied science in the form of technology, and especially media technology, is immersive. It's an environment, just like the air around us. And even the people who don't have the latest iPhone are affected by it. And whether it's in the form of fear or aspiration or whatever. So yes, absolutely education. I think though, I'm not a libertarian. I think that the state has a role to play here in forms of regulation and distribution. So there are policy leverage measures that we can implement. I mentioned Thaler and Sunstein on nudging. They have all kinds of examples for cases in which people have partial information, or when they have fuller information, they still make self-harmful choices. So there are, and if you haven't read, nudge is the basic one, but there's lots of literature. And it's controversial, for sure, because many people see it as a threat to autonomy to have policy that pushes them in a certain direction. But here's a small example. Many of us, in Ontario certainly, and other provinces, on your driver's license, if you have one, there's an organ donation card. And if you sign it, then your organs are allowed to be harvested if you are killed in a car crash. One of their suggestions is make it a reverse effect. So your organs will be harvested unless you sign explicitly that they won't be. Now, many people think, well, wait a second, the state's harvesting my organs? Well, you're still fully autonomous. You just will be informed of the choice, and then you make the choice. But that's a potential positive outcome where you push people, right? Or in this case, you make sure that they push if they want not to be part of a scheme. There are lots of other things that can be done. That's not about your specific question, but it's an example of this kind of policy. And I think it's very interesting to explore these measures, even as we should continue to have this discussion about autonomy and freedom. If I can say one further quick thing about this specific question. I've seen the same thing, by the way. You mentioned downtown East Side Vancouver. I speak in men's shelters in downtown Toronto, and one of the main things that bugs those guys is not that they feel poor, but they feel excluded from the conversation because they don't have phones. And they see everybody walking around with their phones. Now, I don't personally think that the solution is to give everybody phones. I think maybe part of the solution is, I don't have a phone. Maybe some people should put their phones away. Or maybe better, some of the things that are happening on phones need to be brought into other forms of availability. So what is now controlled by an app could be made into a public service, like hailing an Uber. If you don't have the app, you can't use that if you want to. Why aren't there other ways to do that? We've allowed proprietary technology to dominate everyday life in a manner that I think has gone so uncontested that we're not even aware of how comprehensive it is.
Rima?
What's your name? It's yeah. Marika. So I just wanted to add something we didn't talk about, and which I think is shown in what you're asking, is that different socio-demographic groups have different propensities to trust and not trust, and it tends to be the not trusting, and I think that's what Lisa was talking about, the masses, lower education, lower income, women, racialized minorities, so a whole bunch of the isms or whatever tend to have lower trust, and the reason really is because in order to trust, you're taking a risk. And so it's who can afford to take that risk, right? And so if we don't want to just say, oh, well, you're living in poverty and what you really need is to trust, because to take that risk it's a bigger risk for someone because they have more to lose. And so I think that's actually something where we don't have an answer. And we don't know yet because, like, we just know who doesn't trust. But that doesn't mean that to say to trust is the best thing for those particular individuals.
Lisa, anything on solutions before we go to our next question?
Yes, so a couple of comments. One is there's no question that there is a correlation between income inequality and trust in institutions. So if you don't have any hope for your future, then you're definitely not going to trust institutions. Second point is that where I shared the slide around which institution is responsible for the problems in the country, yes, not surprisingly, government comes out on top. But I think that there's a really significant role that corporate Canada and businesses need to contribute to solving those problems. Government can't solve everything. And so when it comes to things like skills retraining, education, corporate Canada needs to step up to the plate. And in my view, not doing nearly enough in helping to come up with those solutions to help people who are disaffected and who are lacking in trust in institutions. Last point I will make is that one of the other things that we actually look at is just around technology, trust in technology and trust in innovation. And what our findings have found through the trust barometer is that it's not that people actually trust the tech sector more than any other sector that we look at.
That's crazy.
It may change this year, but just based on Facebook and Google and everything tied to the US election and Russian interference. But what people aren't comfortable with is the pace of innovation. And I would say that for tech companies, part of their big challenge, but also their opportunity, is they need to be communicating what are the benefits to the end user for this technology, for these innovations, or else we're just not going to be trusting and we're not going to adopt new technologies.
But I was making a facetious remark about it's crazy, but there's a non-crazy version of it because there is a libertarian tendency within tech community to go post-government, right? There are people in Silicon Valley who think that democracy is a joke and that it's over. And they have sufficient power that they can evade state regulation or they can do regulatory capture. This is something that we have to be very aggressive about. That innovation becomes a self-defending principle and therefore gives people a kind of ideological position from which they see this nation state or that nation state as merely a hindrance, a tax burden, which they will try to evade.
I don't know quite what to say to that.
Next question.
Yeah, there's a lot there. We might need another session. So we're going to go to a couple more questions. Let me just say something I should have said before. Please introduce yourself at the start of your question. Ask, because we are tight on time, if you can get to your question as quickly as possible. Et on peut prendre des questions en français aussi, si c'est votre préférence. Please go ahead.
Okay, Brad Wallace from Defence R&D Canada. Getting to the heart of my question may be difficult, but I'll see what I can do for you. First of all, I just want to say to Ms. Kimmel, I feel so much richer for knowing about that trust study. I am going to have to devour that.
And just so everyone knows, it is public. We share it publicly, and there is so much more than what I shared today. And you can just go to edelman.com. You can see the global results as well as the Canadian-specific ones.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Miller there, I have to, ironically, I found that when you were talking about 45, I can't even bring myself to say his name, and you were using terms like freak-so and stuff, I found myself trusting you less. So I just wish to note the irony in here. Okay. Getting to the question, which is going to come across as a wee bit more of a speech, I'm wondering if we're kind of missing a part of the boat here. It's been alluded to multiple times, but I'm wondering if we're missing some connections. We talked about the CEOs not being trusted. We talked about how the powerful, the rich and powerful, they can write their own realities. We see how the Koch brothers are writing their own reality with the whole climate change thing. We talk about the social inequalities, and it seems to me that it is at the heart of this lack of trust comes down to the social inequalities. We have the rich and powerful being protested by the left because of the international trade, or being protested at the right because they're losing their jobs. But it all comes down to my mind, to that social inequality, the lack of opportunities, this sort of thing. The technology which you bemoan, that is not the problem. That is just the tool by which the people at the lower end are complaining, and the people at the higher end are trying to shift our values. So I could go along with connecting threads here for quite some time. There's economic cycles, like which brought us World War I, World War II. We talk about the big lie, or we've heard about the big lie in World War II. So my question to you folks is, do you truly think that, and in fact to the room, do you truly think that we can move beyond this post-truth era without addressing the basic economic inequalities, which, if they are not actually driving it, are certainly making it worse? I'm just going to throw that in your lap and leave it there.
So in a way, this is a yes-no question. There's a little bit of space for people to elaborate, but can we deal with post-truth without dealing with more fundamental questions around inequality? And maybe we'll go down the line, and then we'll let people follow up if they want to add more. Mark, go ahead.
No.
Lisa.
No.
Rima.
I guess our job is also just to draw attention to some of the academic work on the topic. So something, I don't know if people know, that's kind of interesting. First, I think when talking about trust, it's really important to keep in mind the idea of US exceptionalism, because any kind of I love analyzing American data because you always get a big dramatic story and it's publishable in good journals. Canadian data, it's good data, but our trends, nothing is ever very clear, and it's always a wishy-washy story when you work with Canadian data. And then what journal is going to want to publish this kind of, you were saying there's declines, but looking even at the Canadian data, it's not. In the US, the trust decline, it looks like this. But in Canada, it's still kind of I don't know if I'd be comfortable saying there's a dramatic decline in trust in Canada. And then the other thing to know about inequality is, but this is based mainly on a US study, is when they look at inequality across US states, they find the states with the greatest levels of inequality have lower trust. However, changes in inequality over time don't change trust within states, right? So the evidence there is somewhat more mixed than just a story of, we'd like to just say it's inequality and inequality is going up, so trust is going. It's not actually quite as clear as that in terms of the story.
And just to put a point on it, you would also say, though, that along with the other two panelists, we have to address inequality in order to address the trust issue? You're not so categorical.
Wishy-washy result.
This has been surprising. I didn't think we'd get consensus on this, but I didn't think it would be the sociologists.
You know what? I know. I think it's that I find data. I just don't ever find data tells a clear story where I can go and therefore here's the solution. It doesn't. That's what we want it to do, but I just find it's not.
But it was a without which proposition. Right?
So,
yeah.
Okay,
so
well.
We'll call it 2.5 out of 3 panelists say inequality has to be addressed if we want to deal with the post-truth problem. Sir, go ahead.
Hi there. I just want to thank all of you for an excellent panel, mix of data and philosophy. It was fantastic. My name is Johnny Castiglione. I'm a postdoc at U of T. in biochemistry, but I was corrupted by an undergraduate major in philosophy with your student, Bronwyn Singleton.
Ah, right.
So I was very happy to see you here today. My question is, in this room earlier today, we heard that, we're in a post-rational state now where, facts are not sufficient to really change people's minds. It's more of an underlying bedrock of values that you're running up against, and no amount of facts are going to change that. And the data that was put up here today on that barometer shows that, I think, if I read it correctly, one of the highest trusted countries, informed and not informed public, was China. And so I'm questioning what is the causal relationship between facts and data and trust, and to me that suggests that the solution, if there is one, can't be one that's just straightly quantitative. We can model the problem quantitatively, but maybe not solve it in that way.
It's an interesting point of speculation. I have no idea how you would ever advance this suggestion, but it might be the case that if you had a trust barometer for, say, medieval France, you would get a very strong trust result. Because even though it's highly hierarchical and distinctly unequal, people slotting into social positions that they accept and seeing meaning and purpose in their lives, taking up those positions, have a strong degree of trust. So this, in a way, goes back to the previous question. In a democratic society, or an allegedly democratic society, where social inequality is perceived as a problem, as it should be, then we have the trust issue as we have to address it. But I think it's not so simple to see trust in terms of one's comfort with the social position as definitive, right? It has to be seen against the background of the larger social context and the aspirational social context, the ideal of democracy. So that's one thought I had about what you said.
Yeah. We have maybe another minute on this one. We'll have time for one question, then we'll have to wrap up. So go ahead.
I'm actually working on trying to get a paper on that topic published right now, which is that trust researchers, intuitively, it makes no sense that China, if you want to say there's a relationship between democracy and trust, then China shouldn't have the highest trust. We think some of this has to do with how people answer survey questions. So when you look at the Chinese data, so we've looked at the World Values Survey, people tend to just go yes, 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 yes on everything. Whereas in the more democratic countries, they're more critical, and so they'll do a yes and a no, and so then their overall score is lower. And so that's one explanation for that outcome.
Well, that's helpful to know, because the way that I always answer the question around China in our survey is literally with an asterisk beside China, because it's an online survey. And I do wonder about, people's fears around responses and saying that they don't trust government in a country like China. But that's also an interesting.
But that could explain,
Totally.
Your thing could explain that pattern,
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly.
Final question of the day. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Akua Frempong. I'm currently a master's student at Western University studying global health systems in Africa. I just have a quick comment to make before I ask my question, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Lisa, in particular, you talked about how it's important for individuals to reach out and attempt to understand the views of those who are opposed to you. So when I heard that initially, my initial thought was, so as someone who is a racialized woman, I personally wouldn't be on the side to reach out to someone, let's say, who's like a white supremacist or a bigot, because that is detrimental and pretty much it puts me at risk. And so I think when we're thinking about now that we have someone who's south of the border who literally spews all this hatred and there's no consequences for it, I find that it's now allowing people to come out of the woodwork and express those sentiments here. And that's having a negative impact on the individuals that we have here, particularly racialized minorities like myself. So I just want to allude especially to this past summer where the CBC talked about how Islamophobia in Canada has increased by 60%, which was in response to Liberal MP Ikra Khalid passing M1H03, which was the anti-Islamophobia bill. And this was quite interesting because I think it kind of really gave a precedent and actually gave us physical data to say that, you know what, we're actually not immune to this problem, and this is actually a consequence and a result of what's happening. So I'm wondering if you could perhaps speak to, in the survey, if you found that there were specific generations, so I'm not sure how the voting was tallied, whether it was tallied just by, asking for sex or gender or such. If you can perhaps speak to the generations or grouping by age that you found were more immune to these populist views and or distrust than others.
So unfortunately, based on the sample size, we actually aren't able to break the results down by demographic.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I add just one thing about the first part of your comment? I think this is something we need to this is a huge topic to open up at the very end of our session, but there is this I'm going to call it liberal idea, classical liberal ideal, that we need to understand the other. We need to open ourselves up to otherness. And I think that's absolutely true. But there are limits.
Yes.
And my second last Globe column, I made an argument about this in respect specifically of the Charlottesville event and neo-Nazis. You don't need to open yourself up to neo-Nazis. I mean...
I have no interest in sitting down and having a conversation.
Well, Charles Taylor, the great liberal philosopher, said, liberalism itself is a fighting creed. At a certain point, you have to fight. If people are actually undermining the very possibility of discourse, then they don't deserve to be heard. They deserve to be fought.
Thank you very much. I'm going to provide a couple of closing remarks and ask Renata to come up and make a few remarks on behalf of the conference. But maybe I'd just like to ask everyone to join me in thanking our panelists right now for an outstanding conversation. When Peter, in our office at the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences, first started talking about this session and the opportunity to do it several months ago, I was immediately excited about the prospect. And the closer it's come, the more excited I've become. First, because I got to have a chance to speak with our panelists and feel the distinct but in some ways complementary perspectives you brought. And I thought it really made for a nice conversation. And I'm very, very gratified by the turnout we've had for this and the attention and the interest that you have shown in this conversation. I really do want to thank the Canadian Science Policy Conference for giving us this opportunity. I think it's clear we could do 3-4 more sessions in the future on topics that were raised today. So thank you so much. We post all of the events we do at the Federation under our Big Thinking banner online at our website. So feel free to visit the website to see a video recording of this conversation and others that we've done in the past. Thank you again, and I will ask Renata to come up and just bring the session to a finish.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I also wanted to extend sincere thanks to the panel. I think the lively discussions that we've had here clearly show that science is not just the hard sciences or, sit in the lab. We are very grateful that this conference provides such a platform for broad discussion and clear inclusion of social sciences and humanities, and points to the importance of having this discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this session. And I wish you all the best for the upcoming panels, yet we still have another day.